Okay, as we continue, now we get to talk about bad guys. Sometimes, and this might surprise you, that there are bad people in the world who engage in commercial transactions. And we have a couple of examples here. What happens, for instance, if someone steals goods and then sells them? Who's the owner? What if someone, a bad guy, obtains goods by fraud or deception and then sells them? Who's the owner? Well, we answer those questions here with our discussions of void and voidable title. Let's start with void title. Void, of course, means as though it never occurred, right? So void title says that if title, in quotes because it doesn't really exist, is obtained by theft, then the possessor has no legal claim to the property. In other words, you can't get good title through theft. So let's assume that President Thomas, president of the university, has an art collection, and Professor March, who works at the university, is an art collector and dealer. And so one night he breaks into the president's house and he steals a painting, a very valuable painting. And it's complete theft. He's a thief. He steals it. And then he comes to me, who doesn't know a lot about art, but I know good art when I see it, and he sells it to me. And he sells it to me at a reasonable price. And so I buy the painting. President Thomas then finds out about the theft. He's able to track down the painting to me, and he asks for it back. And the question is, who owns the painting? Right? Is it President Thomas or is it me? Well, how did I obtain my interest in the painting or my title? I claimed ownership. I claimed it from a thief, which means I only obtained void title, which means I never really owned it in the first place. Now, if you think about it, you might think, well, that's kind of unfair, right? Because I didn't know it was stolen. And so I'm going to lose out on the money because, of course, March is gone. He's out of town in Mexico. We'll never find him. So somebody is going to lose in this example, right? Either President Thomas is going to lose out on his painting, which he did nothing wrong in just owning and having it stolen, or I'm going to lose out. And I did nothing, in a sense, wrong because all I did was try to purchase a painting. Well, if we follow the chain of title, we see that it makes some sense and fairness to say that you can never lose title to your property through theft. And so that's void title. Okay, so if we change it up a little bit, and now we say that Professor March goes to Thomas, and he agrees to buy a painting. And they negotiate a price, and so Thomas gives March the painting. March then gives Thomas a check for the painting, knowing, of course, that the check is not good, knowing that he doesn't have enough funds, and the whole thing is a deception or a fraud. So March then takes the painting, and before the check can clear the bank, he comes to me. And March then sells me the painting, and I pay money for it, and then I take the painting. Same thing happens. March, of course, is gone. He's out of town. We'll never find him. He's in Mexico. And President Thomas finds the painting and that I have it, and he wants me to give it back. Now, what's the result? Well, as we can see here, the title is a little bit different. Title that is purchased, in quotes there, by fraud or deception is limited and inferior to the rights of the original owner, but it still may be transferred to third parties. So in this case, I would be the legitimate owner of the painting. Why? Because it wasn't obtained through theft, it was obtained through deception or fraud. If someone's going to lose out, if it's either going to be President Thomas or me, at least Thomas had some control over whether he was deceived. He could have required, more security, a cash payment or a guarantee of payment, something like that. So at least there's some measure of fault on his end. Now, of course, if he could ever find March, he could make March liable for, the value of the deception or the fraud. But usually in these circumstances, the parties remaining after the bad guy is gone are fighting over the property itself. And in this case, me being what we call a bona fide purchaser, I would receive good title to the property. So let's talk about that term, bona fide purchaser. What does that mean? Because we see that come up from time to time when we're talking about title and ownership claims. A bona fide purchaser is an innocent buyer. We say that a BFP, or a bona fide purchaser, obtains good title to goods purchased in the ordinary course of business, even if the seller has voidable title, just like my previous example. In order to be a BFP, we have to show two things. One, that the BFP, the purchaser, gave value for the goods, money or something else of value, and acted in good faith. In other words, was an innocent buyer. Some people have referred to bona fide purchasers as a pure heart and an empty head. Right? We just know that these goods are being offered to us, and we buy not knowing how the seller obtained them. Now, in my example, I may not be considered a BFP if I had some indication that the goods didn't belong to March. For instance, if March bought the painting that was worth $5 million, and everybody knew this, and he agreed to sell it to me for $500, then my status as a BFP may be at risk because I maybe either knew or should have known that there was something wrong there. I may not be purchasing there in good faith, and I may have to ask a few questions about how he obtained this painting that he's now selling me at a huge discount. Okay, one other thing here with the ownership claims of goods and bad guys, and that is entrustment. This is where you entrust someone to care or watch or fix your goods. This is typically where you leave goods with a merchant. And I have here on the slide, look out, watch out. Whenever you leave your goods with a merchant who's in the business of buying and selling goods of that type, then watch out, because the UCC 4032 talks about what happens when the merchant is a bad guy and sells your goods to someone else. So let's go through that with our definition here. 4032 of the UCC says, entrusting goods to a merchant who deals in goods of that kind gives the merchant the power to transfer all the rights of the entruster to a buyer in the ordinary course of business. You think, what? Okay, so let's say that I have an expensive watch and it stops working, and so I need to have it fixed. So I go to a jewelry store that sells watches of that type, and they also repair them. And they sell some, obviously, new watches of that type, and they also sell used watches of that type because they're very valuable, even used. And so let's say I leave my watch in the care of the jewelry store as they are fixing it. So the jewelry store makes the repairs, and one of the workers at the jewelry store, after making the repair, leaves it out on their counter. Customer comes into the jewelry store, sees my watch that's sitting there, and asks the jewelry store to purchase it. And let's say the jewelry store sells it. What happens? Who owns the watch in that case? Well, the UCC says if I entrust my goods to a merchant that sells goods of that particular type, then I may lose out to an innocent buyer. So if the customer who comes in buys it, of course not knowing that the watch truly belongs to me, and assuming that since it's there being held out for sale by the jewelry store, that the jewelry store owns it, then the innocent buyer, the customer, may get to keep the watch and have good title to it. I would lose out in that case. I would have to be more careful in terms of who I entrust my goods to. A couple of terms I want to point out here with entrustment. First, goods of that kind. The merchant, here in our entrustment example, must be in the business of buying and selling goods of that type or a similar type. And this is, of course, protection for the innocent buyer. If a person comes into a jewelry store as a customer and buys a big screen TV, then the seller, the jewelry store in that example, is not a seller of goods of that type if that's the only TV that they're selling. So they wouldn't qualify under this entrustment statute. Also, ordinary course of business. Again, the buyer purchases the goods in good faith and doesn't know of the true ownership. If the buyer has some reason to believe that the jewelry store in my example doesn't own the watch and purchases it anyway, then they may not be considered a buyer in the ordinary course of business. Let's talk about creditors' rights for a second. I've made allusion to this earlier, and we will talk in much greater detail about this in another chapter still to come. But let's talk about a security interest. You may or may not be familiar with these. A security interest is an interest in goods obtained by a creditor, giving the creditor the right of repossession. Right? This makes the goods subject to a security interest collateral. You probably are familiar with that term. Right? So if we have, for instance, a business who borrows money from a bank, like in my example of the backhoe from the beginning of this chapter, and then takes the goods that are purchased using the loaned money and puts them out on the lot for sale. They're part of the business's inventory. The bank that loans the business money will typically ask for a security interest in those goods. In other words, they'll ask that until the business pays back the loan, that the bank has a security interest or the right to repossess those goods if the payments aren't made. Okay, so let's take our example of the backhoe for a second, and let's say Bob's Backhoes has a whole bunch of backhoes on its lot that they hold out for sale as part of their inventory. But they still owe Big Bank a lot of money, and they missed some of their payments. And now maybe they're in default, and Big Bank is ready to come in and repossess all of the collateral that secures the loan. What if I come onto the lot and I want to buy a particular backhoe that's part of the inventory that has a security interest in it from the bank, or in other words, over which the bank holds a security interest. But I'm a normal customer. I'm a buyer in the ordinary course of business, and I pay value for the backhoe and I take the backhoe. When the bank comes in to repossess all of Bob's backhoe's inventory, can they follow the sale to me? Can they come to me and take that backhoe too as repossession as part of their security interest? And the general answer there is no. If I'm a buyer in the ordinary course of business, then I can take those goods free and clear of any security interest. Okay, let's talk about a couple of special types of sales and how these are treated. What we call returnable goods. Returnable goods are goods that a seller will allow to be returned on certain conditions, even if no complaints about the quality of the goods are made. This is just part of the terms of the sale. So we have two types here of sales that we're going to look at: a sale on approval and a sale or return. The first is a sale on approval arrangement. This is where the buyer takes the goods with the right to return them after testing them or using them for a while. Okay, so let's say that we have Mike the mechanic, right? And he owns a garage where he fixes vehicles. And the Ford Motor Company comes to him and says, we are now manufacturing this diagnostic machine. And the diagnostic machine, you know, you plug it into the newer cars and it'll run diagnostic tests and tell you what the problem is. And it makes your job a lot easier. So why don't you buy this machine from us? And Mike says, well, I'm not sure. I might want to try that out for a little bit, see how it works first. So Ford and Mike the mechanic agree to a sale on approval. And Mike agrees on a certain price. And Ford says, all right, why don't you take the diagnostic machine and use it in your shop for 30 days. And if you're not satisfied with it, you don't like it, you can just return it. You don't owe us anything, we'll just cancel the contract. Okay, so Mike takes the diagnostic machine, puts it in his garage. At the same time, Mike owes money to his bank. And the bank has a security interest in all of Mike's equipment. All the equipment that's in Mike's building. And Mike defaults, and the bank comes in to repossess everything. And as part of the repossession, they take the diagnostic machine. So the question then is, who gets it? Does the bank, according to their repossessory interest, get it because it's part of the equipment that's covered by the security interest? Or does Ford get it back because it was never title never truly passed to Mike? And the answer is that the goods under a sale on approval are not subject to the buyer's creditors until the buyer accepts them. In other words, the bank cannot repossess the diagnostic machine at least until the end of the 30 days, the trial period, is over and Mike accepted them. So in other words, Ford would get it back. Another type of arrangement that might exist is a sale or return, what we would consider a consignment sale. right? And you might be familiar with consignment sales. But this is where the buyer takes goods intending to resell them, but has the right to return them if they're not sold. So we have consignment stores now that are pretty popular, and let's say that I have a consignment store and I've borrowed money from the bank, and I've given the bank a security interest in all my inventory and all my equipment and everything else that I own as part of my business, and I'm not making my payments. Well, it just so happens that, let's say, Professor March comes in and he's got some electronic goods that, a big screen TV and a DVD player and some other things that he wants to have sold through my consignment store. And we work out an arrangement where I will take them and I'll put them in my store, but I can return them after 30 days if they don't sell. And I pay him for them and I put them in my store. Then the bank comes in to repossess everything. The bank also takes the stuff that was given to me by Professor March to sell, and the question is, who gets the goods? Is it the bank as part of the repossessory interest, or is it Professor March? Well, we can see here on a sale or return that the goods are subject to the buyer's creditors. In other words, if we have a true consignment arrangement, then the bank would get to repossess the electronic equipment, and March would lose out on